I know my wife and I actually, after I got home from the university yesterday, went out and walked on the beach. It's just gorgeous this time of the year for it to be so dry, and we enjoy it. But I also want to thank the organizers for the invitation. And what I want to talk to you about is probably maybe different than what you may have at previous conferences. But what I want to do is I want to look at a set of pieces that if we're really talking about moving sort of from a health care perspective into a wellness perspective and want to use data for that, how does one kind of put all of those different pieces together and how to look at it, and to use some real life examples of where that is. So if you'll bear with me a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through several pieces of this and try to connect them and then show how they can kind of all come together. So we'll see. I do have, want to declare one conflict. I do sit on the board of directors of a company. It's a small healthcare associated company that's in point of care technology. And since I'll talk about point of care technology later, I didn't want to declare it. I will say that the company has really evolved out of graduates from the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, trying to deal with this whole idea of how do you get greater access to information and digitalization within health. I also want to say, isn't it great to actually be back where you're having conferences and you're face-to-face with individuals, or at least hybrid? I find that that has been just so rewarding again to get back to that this last year. It's great. So great to have you here. We're at an interesting stage, I think, and having just come out of the COVID, and I was talking to one of your organizers about the fact that there seems to be a several-year period that just nothing seemed to happen. And you realize all of a sudden that, oh, it was 5 or 6 years ago when we were doing whatever because of all of that time period. But if you really think about what COVID has done around healthcare, it's brought a number of things to bear. One is just the sheer pressure on the healthcare system and the individuals that are in that. And about a third of the healthcare providers in Canada have left the system since COVID, okay, and the pressure that was found there. The other thing is there's just been an unbelievable adoption of new technologies at an unprecedented speed because of COVID. It says that one can do it, okay, if one really gets going. The other thing is having just come back from San Francisco about a week and a half ago, in which a city that is driven by technology and innovation, one of the most expensive places to live, suddenly has all sorts of shops and stores going out of business. And that's because nobody's come back to work in their offices downtown. They're staying home. And that's an important thing to do, that whether it's learning for students or working for adults, the whole way we do it has kind of changed a little bit. So if COVID has shown issues with health, technology is moving, the way we expect things and the way we do things are different. And then the needs of the patient populations. There were things that occurred during COVID that normally would have been face-to-face, and suddenly one had to deal with it not face-to-face and use technology to do it. And the nature of the patient populations. Those that were extremely immunosuppressed, anticoagulation therapy. Suddenly you couldn't do that in a doctor's office or in a clinic in the way you did it before. You had to do it in a different way. And the other thing is just artificial intelligence. And you can't turn on the news anywhere in the world and not hear something about artificial intelligence, but even the concept of conversational artificial intelligence being incorporated into all sorts of apps. So the world's changing pretty quick. And so how do we move from sickness to wellness? And what is really the future of healthcare in there? Right now, there's a number of different health authorities. We all do it, okay, that collect data, how well we're looking after ourselves. And that's telling us that there's more that we need to do. The other thing that's really important is the whole change in the speed in which technology is not only being produced, but is starting to roll out. But the trajectory is really changing. Okay, and that includes things like genomics and that, and somebody mentioned that right away this morning. The other thing that's rather interesting is when you really talk to patients and consumers, the interesting thing is what they want is a very individualized, okay, care system, and their care. But they want it delivered not dissimilar to the way you buy items online now. They want it fast. They don't want to have to wait, call, make an appointment, go sit, wait to have that done, wait to get the results back. They want things more like they order off of Amazon or eBay or so on, but they want it very personalized. The good news is that this digital shift has been incredibly successful in what occurred during COVID. And as we really look at it in detail, we realize that when you're pressed, you really can do these things. And so the question is now, do you really use this now and turn it into more preventative care, moving toward wellness? And so, being in pharmacy education now for 40 years, I will speak somewhat from a pharmacy perspective. I think you can think about it in broader terms, in broader healthcare system, but I think it also, I will talk about how I think we underutilize pharmacy around the world. Today's pharmacist is really largely responsible for helping patients navigate what is a really complex system, okay? And it's a costly healthcare system. And while it deals mostly with drug therapies and new therapies and expensive therapies, it also involves technologies. And one of the things I'll mention several times, and certainly deals with in most of North America, Europe, most parts of Asia, certainly, and some parts of Africa, your most accessible healthcare provider actually is that community pharmacist that's out there. So I think there's ways to take advantage of that. So what we have is this changing that's occurred. We've seen what has to happen and what can happen because of COVID. Technology is taking over, and we have some underutilized and poorly used resources within the system. So how do you really empower patients to better manage their own health and well-being? Well, the quality and effectiveness, effective care really requires much more intimate and intensive relationship and understanding between the patient and whoever the healthcare provider is. And that's going to be a real theme here. In other words, we've done this for a long time, but the reality is we haven't really done it deep enough. And I'm struck simply by the fact of having recently gone to the doctor. And the doctor actually, in sitting down with the doctor, okay, and somebody who has been out of medical school only, and the residency and internships only about 5 years, so relatively young, really quite knowledgeable, really knew very little about me, even though I had been there before, took a moment to look at his written notes and a couple things on the computer, talked to me for 10 minutes, suggested a particular test, and that was it. And I suggest that whatever he had written, whatever he had on the computer, okay, really knowing me in a deep enough way to be able to start to shift from simply healthcare to wellness and helping to inform that, okay, is where we need to change. So from a pharmacy perspective, one of the things we talk about all the time in academia, academic pharmacy, and that you see more and more out in practice, particularly in North America and in Europe, somewhat in Asia, is this whole concept of how technology and biotechnology, particularly genomics, is allowing you to get more information about the individual, better be able to suggest what drugs would work with what individuals and so on. And that's important in that technology. But I want to point out, okay, that when you look at that, you need to go a little further. Somebody mentioned this morning in the introduction, precision medicine. Okay, there's another phrase that's used, and I believe it's Leroy Hood at the University of Washington that's kind of coined this, and that was P4 medicine rather than just precision medicine. And P4 medicine was really to go a little bit further than that. Not only is it personalized, okay, but it's predictive, it's participatory in a much more active way, and it could be therefore preventative. And that becomes important. And with that now, if you look at technology, and I've only chosen the concept of pharmacogenomics and the genetic factors that go in. If we look at a dose of a drug, for instance, and what happens in this pharmacokinetic phase, getting to where it has to act, and this pharmacodynamic phase, PD, where it actually acts and what it does. Okay, they're controlled by genetic factors play a distinct role, but there's a whole set of environmental pieces that are there. And what's interesting is the most well understood drug, okay, an anticoagulant, and the pharmacogenomics of it is still only about 55% predictive, because it's all that environmental factor, the viral type, that becomes the key. So now, information, and how do you get that information to better know and to learn about your patient, to learn about yourself if you are an individual, such as myself. I would like to know more about myself, be able to really manage my own wellness, okay? And then put it together with all these other things that the learning is part of the system, okay? I think this whole P4 issue an idea is an important one, because it is much more participatory, and the idea is to move it more toward preventative. And so that's really sort of the piece to take out of this item. So the other thing is there's probably never been a better time to start really using all this data. And one of the biggest things about it is if I were to think about earlier in my career, okay, if I wanted to really use data for something for my research that involved health, the delivery of health or healthcare, I would actually have to have a clear understanding of the questions I was going to ask, so I could create a database to do that. Now, because of analytical technologies used within data, you can collect all sorts of information. You can connect databases all around the world, and you can query questions you never even considered at the time you created that database, in a way that you can now start to use data completely differently from the way you have before. You get to really a better understanding of diseases. We have a better understanding, but how do you put it to use? Better understanding of the patient and what do you need to collect for that. And therefore you can really deliver more accurate, personalized treatment and move along that. I only chose this again because I'm using pharmacy as the example here, but pharmacoinformatics, pharmacy informatics, that wasn't anything up until about 2000. And over the last 5 years, that's really taken off. People started to talk about it in about 2000, but it has only been the last 5 years in which we actually assure that graduates walking out of the School of Pharmacy, a Faculty of Pharmacy, a College of Pharmacy, anywhere in the world that I know, certainly, okay, that actually have skill sets that can utilize that information. So from the healthcare perspective, it's starting to be there. So if you're really going to innovate, if you're really going to move health to wellness, okay, it's going to come with a better understanding of the patient. And so we might as well use the term that scientifically used, and that's that phenotype of that patient. Okay. And once again, I'll use that phrase I used before. The quality and effective care requires a much more detailed and deeper knowledge of the patient. So phenotype, what does that really mean? Well, in the simplest terms, it's what I've shown here. I may have a certain set of genetic characteristics that I have from my parents. And when those are expressed, it says that at one time I had blondish hair, which I don't have much of anymore. Okay, I have somewhat blue eyes. I have a tremendously athletic figure. All sorts of things that characterize me. And a reflection, not only that genetic information that's there, but all of the other experiences and exposures in life that I've experienced, whether I've smoked, whether I have not been a smoker, the various medications I've taken, how compliant I've been, various accidents or incidents that I've had over a period of time. And all of those then say something about if you know that information, okay? The phenotype is determined by the genotype as well as those environmental influences on those genes. And we know that really well because there's been so many studies of identical twins, okay, in which one develops cancer, the other one doesn't. Both are smokers, but one develops cancer, one doesn't. And all sorts of other things like that. Okay, so this idea of genotype and phenotype. And we're going to get back to this idea, if you're going to phenotype, how deep do you have to do it? How distinctive do you have to do it? How do you do it within the healthcare system to get the information you need to move toward wellness, another dot? And how do you democratize it enough so that the broad population can get access to that and be part of that? So genotype really is that genetic information, and DNA to RNA, RNA to protein, and that tells us something. But it's those things that interact with that protein, or the proteins that interact, and suddenly now that's really is reflective of us. Okay, and I would suggest to you that while we can do all this thing, and we're really excited about pulling the left side of the slide into healthcare, the reality is we don't find a way to collect the information that tells us about the right side of that slide, then we don't really understand those stick figures. And they are only stick figures to us. They're not really a fleshed out individual. Okay? So part of it is medication history. And I'll reflect on that, because even though I've been in health education, pharmacy education for 40 years, but I really reflect on how well I've kept track of everything that is involved with my health. And the surgery I had around this such and such eye, I couldn't even remember which eye it was at one time. You know, we as individuals don't keep track of all that very well. The healthcare system has it in pieces. Okay, the electronic health record helps with that. But I suggest to you, to this stage yet, we still don't really know deep enough. And what I will say is almost all of the research into using these technologies, biotechnologies like pharmacogenomics, things about the microbiome, all sorts of things about epigenetics, all of that is showing that it's good to do all that work, but if you don't know the individual deeper than that, in the broadest sense, okay, then you really can't use that information as well as you could. So the deeper you can get, the more accurate you get, the more you're going to know the patient, the more you're going to know this viral type, the better you can be. Excuse me. So what you really want is not that 10 minutes you're in with the physician collecting the information, or quickly picking up your prescription in the pharmacy, or whatever that interaction within the healthcare system is. But you want to have them know you more as the whole person, the full phenotype. And there's no doubt there's been lots of studies showing that where medical history errors occur, how clinically important those are. And they're due to a whole set of things that are difficult. But even when they are good, it still does limit the use of that information and how good it is to use. So if we go back to this, the question then becomes, how do we take advantage of all those things that go into this viral type? The social habits, culture, health, wellness, disease, patient compliance, medication errors, things we learn around epigenetics and so on. How do you take advantage of that? And that gets at this idea, how do you get much more detailed and deeper knowledge? And that really can occur at the patient-caregiver interface in a way we just don't do it right now. So from a scientific perspective, from a researcher's perspective, they talk about deep phenotyping. And you start to see that phrase, and I don't think it's a bad phrase to use publicly in the general context of health. It isn't a matter of just knowing about the patient, but it's knowing about the patient deeper and constantly collecting more and more of that information about the individual. And because that information can be used not just from one database, but from multiple databases based on technology, it doesn't matter that as the patient owns that information, the patient keeps a great deal of that. The healthcare system at various places within the healthcare home have pieces of that. Okay, but if we could do it better, if we could do it more precise, okay, we'd end up with richer, deeper, more precise characterization and understanding of the patient, and there's a lot you could do. What you would end up then is really, okay, is much deeper insights into a better understanding of the patient and a better ability to forecast. And that's the point I'm trying to make. So what we've talked about is the need to do it, the unique relationship we're in time, because of COVID and other things, the way technology is coming in, the fact that we're excited about using technology, but there's a bunch of work that needs to be done to really take advantage of all that technology. There's this information we're doing electronic health records, but we need more in those records than what we are currently taking, okay? If we really are going to move toward a prevention paradigm, if we're going to move toward a wellness paradigm and better health, not just simply care. So deep phenotyping really is defined as the precise and comprehensive analysis of phenotypic abnormalities, which the individual components of the phenotype are observed and described. Okay, definitions like that. Basically, it's this idea of a much fuller understanding of the individual. The reason I suggest the pharmacist has the opportunity to do it is the nature of how practice in pharmacy occurs. Every time the individual goes in to pick up a prescription, every time the individual, think about that, when you feel like you have a cold, or you have a cough, or you have whatever, you don't immediately go to the doctor quite often, you go to the pharmacy and pick up something from the over-the-counter, okay, medication. You have a chance to interact with that pharmacist gets to know you. My mother passed away at the end of last year, and was 92. But there is little doubt that her closest healthcare provider, the one that she confided in most, the one that she interacted in most, was not her gerontologist or her general practitioner. It was the pharmacist that was a block and a half from her, because she spent more time interacting with them. And so part of what I'm suggesting is we need to use the pharmacist better in collecting that information. And the pharmacist would be a good place for the deep phenotyping. But to do that, the nature of the education that we have at pharmacy schools, okay, needs to change, and the nature of the processes need to change. Okay, but deep phenotyping requires processing a broad range of data types, which might actually be voice recordings, videos, not just genome sequences and biological pathways out of there. There's things that one can collect. And so P4 medicine, if you're really looking at the deep phenotyping for the whole patient, really requires a much more precise relationship between genes and the phenotype, a deep phenotype. Accurately collected clinical data is a basic staple of knowing your patient. It can empower your patient. The electronic health record, administrative and claims records, human phenotype data collected from clinical practice present an unprecedented opportunity. It's a great digital opportunity, which is the theme of your conference. But what that requires from a whole patient perspective is the identification of connections between diseases and overall health and their common phenotypic traits. Since you're in BC, there's a healthy seniors study group here, in which there are individuals in which the patients themselves are in their 80s and 90s and don't have any of the common major diseases. And their parents didn't either. And trying to understand what is different about them than all the rest of us. Okay? And that's been difficult to do. A lot of genomic work has been done on that. And there's very few genomic clues that's given. It has a lot to do with the way they've lived life and the things they've been exposed to. Okay? So science is informed by what it is possible to measure, and it takes a great leap forward when it can measure something new. And so that becomes the issue, and I realize a great digital opportunity spelled wrong, so we'll get off that slide right away. So the types of things that one can go ahead and do in this. And I think one thing we can do is really embrace the whole concept that's been talked about for a number of years now, and that is this continuous learning healthcare system. The idea that you're going to get much deeper detail and deeper knowledge through continuous learning. That came out of really the U.S. Institute of Medicine, which is now called the National Academy of Medicine. But in 2007, they started publishing a group of papers and studies around how you can create, quote, a continuous learning healthcare system. And I believe if one looks, there's almost 14 different pieces that have been produced over about 15 years, okay, in this area. But it's really defined in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation. With best practices seamlessly embedded in the delivery process, patients and families active participants in all elements, and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of every delivery experience. So whether it's in the doctor's office, in a clinic, you're interacting with a nurse practitioner or an LPN, you're going into a pharmacy, okay, there's information collected, and that becomes important, okay, and that starts to create this deeper phenotype. I will say for those of you who are visiting Vancouver, they're building the new hospital of the future, the new St. Paul's and Providence Healthcare. They're building, and the concept that is being built around is exactly this, the continuous learning healthcare system, and trying to build around that idea. So how do you empower your patients to get much more detailed and deeper knowledge? And if I might, okay, that I think is the real key here. So if we have a driving force, the nature of the things we saw around COVID, we understand the challenges within the system are not just cost, but even the human side of that. We know what patients want, what consumers want now, something personalized, but something quick and easy and straightforward to get. Okay, we know that some parts of the healthcare system maybe aren't utilized as well as they could. We understand that there's a tremendous amount of technology coming forward, and being put into the system. But there's likely to be information data that is important to actually get the full use out of that. And we have to find a way to get it out to everybody. Okay? So that new paradigm through which people gain greater control over their decisions and actions affecting their own health is the next piece. How do you really empower patients in part of the system? Because I think if you can't do each of the pieces, then it's hard to really do the whole thing and be really successful. So really benefits of incorporating empowerment strategies in care are really well documented, and a lot of people are studying that now. But empowered patients are more likely to stick to recommendations made by the healthcare providers because they are now active participants. It's part of that P4 concept. So helpful ways you can empower your patients. Nature is a healthcare provider, look at the way you interact with them, asking them open-ended questions. What is the one thing you can do this week to help you reach your research goal, and helping them figure that out? The reality is within the system, there's only so much time to do each of these. And every Wednesday, when I was with Providence Healthcare and a VP with Providence Healthcare, we would have a 4-hour meeting talking about the healthcare within that part of the system, public healthcare system. And a lot of it would be allocating human and fiscal and other resources to various services that had to be delivered, whether it was knee replacements or this disease or whatever. And how much do you deliver? How many patients can you do within a period of time and afford it within the public healthcare system? Okay, well, when you start thinking about that, the more you can empower people to play a role and make better decisions, the better off you are. So continuously learning, capturing information, okay, by whatever those things are we talked about or things that you can think of. Okay, it starts to get us better at this deep phenotyping, which will help with this. So getting back to this, okay, if you want to get a much more detailed and deeper knowledge on the patient, then I suggest part of it is point of care testing. And part of the problem with point of care testing are the Theranoses. And are most of you familiar with the company Theranos? How many of you are? Some of you are, right? They're going to do a movie. They did a movie about it, and the woman who was the CEO, I think, has just been sentenced to jail a couple months ago or whatever. They had some of the most powerful people in the U.S. on her board, so people believed that Walgreens signed an agreement with them. Okay, and it was point of care testing that actually wasn't good, wasn't effective, didn't really work. Okay, couldn't really deliver what it is. The interesting thing about it, that has really hurt the concept around point of care testing. And point of care testing has actually gotten quite a bit better. Okay, so there are things that you can do around point of care testing now that might be useful, and you can put it into places that historically would not have done that. In other words, into pharmacies, but starting to look at it even in your homes. Now, if you think about it, diabetics have monitored their blood glucose levels for a long, long time. And that's point of care testing. It's the nature of the technologies that go to it. So the global point of care testing market is projected to be at about 50 billion US dollars in 2025, up from about 29.5 billion just 2020, a few years ago. Okay, and COVID-19 really has driven somewhat the point of care diagnostics market, because how many of you have taken a COVID test somewhere other than in a doctor's office or a clinic? Probably almost every one of us, right? So I won't go over the FIP statement from the International Pharmaceutical Federation, but the key is here, okay, is that point of care testing is really a way to leverage knowledge, skills, and accessibility of various other health professionals, including pharmacists, that can play a role here. So what I want to point out here is I have a number of different point of care tests. I've covered up what companies are involved with all of that, but a number of different devices that are out there. There's been quite a bit of work now to look at how good these devices are, how reproducible they are. Okay, really to certify them. And the technologies are really getting much, much better and getting much easier to use. The reality is, if you're going to really take this into the healthcare system and put it into more accessible places such as community pharmacies, what you're going to have to assure is that the quality of that is there. It's not a Theranos. It really is a valid test that can be reproduced. It can be validated. Okay, it has to be done at a cost that's cost effective. It has to be done in a way that both it's easy for the patient and the consumer, but also easier for the person that's going to do it. And these are a set of various tests that are out there. So I'm going to talk about one particular group here. And there is a diagnostic instrument that's out there. There's, in this case, what it does is it looks at 21 biomarkers that are out there. It's actually been validated by the major certification organization in Canada that certifies the laboratory testing in Canada as being actually better than most of the laboratory tests that are done out there, and more reproducible. It does 21 biomarkers. It tests things around the health of your heart, liver, blood sugar, kidney, and renal, that electrolytes, the liver and liver function. Out of that, you can add in things around A1C with the right devices, the right test. You can do COVID testing, which they've done. The key is that whatever technology is used, there's got to be a way to get easy access to the results. And I was struck by walking over here to the session this morning as I walked from our home down by the water up to here. How many people, when they cross the street, are just looking at their phone? And if I said at least half of the individuals walking across the intersection, at the different intersections, were looking on their phone, that would not have been an exaggeration. Okay, that's how people look at things. And if you're not getting results back to them, okay, in an easy readable form, that's it. So part of this idea of data, information, deep phenotyping, as you're collecting the information, is one way to maybe get more information about the individual are these kind of point of care tests and getting them into places that are more accessible to the individuals and easier to get. Then it's getting the results not only to the record, but to the individual. It's also doing it in a way that makes some sense. So in other words, if I got back a whole bunch of data, it would take me a while to understand what that data really meant. Okay, how significant it was. But if there was a way you could help do that interpretation for them as part of this, and maybe add data as it comes out, something that might have red, green, and yellow. Okay, green means you're probably okay, just like a green light, the stoplight. Yellow means caution. You want to maybe start watching. Red maybe means you need to take another test. You need to consult with your healthcare provider, okay, to follow up on that issue. Something that designates that, but it has to be easy to interpret. The next thing that becomes important, if you're going to digitalize, you're going to use this information, you're going to do deep phenotyping, is the idea that you have to explain the results. And you have to do it in two different levels almost. And that is that we always knew that we had to explain it well for the individual, the patient, the consumer themselves. But if you're in this business, you have to explain it to the healthcare provider too. The number of healthcare providers that really understand all of the ins and outs and the aspects of all of this, okay, it's surprising what a challenge that is. And that'll change as pharmacy education and medical education and nursing education and so on keep changing, but there's work there too. So you've got to really create information. Okay, the result that's shown here, okay, has to do with the GRF around kidney function. It turns out that British Columbia did a pilot study using one of these point of care devices, in which the pharmacist was to simply go look through the healthcare records that they had for existing patients at their pharmacy. There were 6 pharmacies in the province, spread out around the province, and working with the BC Pharmacy Association. And what they were to do is the pharmacist was to look through the health record of that individual, determine if they had a certain number of risks associated with kidney failure, show up in that record, and if they had a relative that had kidney failure. Then do a point of care test and look at the results, okay, the filtration rate. Okay, and what it turned out is about 20% of the individuals that they tested, okay, actually tested for phase 3 renal failure. Okay, which is where you want to catch them if they're starting to have renal failure. You don't want them to get into stage 4 and stage 5 renal failure. So the ability to actually inform the health of the individual to start watching what they do, but also the healthcare system as the individuals who are not even diagnosed yet with those diseases is important. But as I kind of pull this all together now, the key is if you're going to do this, think about what you have to do to actually change it within the system. Walk into a pharmacy and just watch the pharmacist for an hour and how busy they are. If this suddenly is going to go into a pharmacy or somewhere else in the healthcare system, it has to go in a way that's easy to implement. So you actually have to create kind of a patient flow and a whole process on how to do it. You have to really make it turnkey, or it's hard to get people to change. You're always going to have early adopters. But how do you get it so that it spreads across the whole system, so that it becomes available for the widest group? Okay? And you keep capturing new knowledge around that mistake. So you're more familiar than I am probably about all the trends that are affecting healthcare these days. Shifting demographics, the morbidities and multi-morbidities, all sorts of government policies and strategies and issues that affect the delivery of healthcare. Okay, and the key is technology and the use of data. So with that said, if you're going to do this, okay, then how do you make the change? And part of it is we're going to have to really study processes for change, okay, and do them better. And there's lots. I picked Cotter's 8-step process of change. It doesn't matter which one you do. But the key is, how do we practice P4 medicine without collecting that information and dephenotyping? And how do you do dephenotyping if you're not going to do point-of-care technology? I don't know. And how do we move forward in wellness without being able to have that kind of dephenotyping? And how do you do it without point-of-care technology? The key is, with the project that I've been involved with in that group, we did a pilot in 11 pharmacies for one of the chain pharmacy companies, chain pharmacies here in Canada. Started out with 11, it went to 50. There's now 454 as of last week, 454 pharmacies that they actually have 1 or 2 of these point-of-care devices. They may be testing only a few biomarkers. In other words, the ones that tend to be reimbursed, for instance, in Ontario, the things that are reimbursed are around glucose levels, A1Cs, and lipids. But they have the capability of doing 21 to 27 biomarkers as part of this. And the interesting thing is when you do surveys of the patients, what they tell you is they feel closer to their healthcare provider than they ever did, which means they probably will listen, interact more, you can collect more information. And the healthcare provider says it's probably one of the most enjoyable part of my day is involved with that. Okay. That pilot now will expand. It's been announced that the National Health Service and a pharmacy chain in Great Britain will start a pilot next month in this, and another English-speaking country and another continent. Okay, is actually going through the process and doing all the legal stuff to look at this. In other words, it really can start moving. The chain in Canada has said that it will now expand to all of its pharmacies. And the second chain has now started, or is going through the process of getting ready to do a pilot around this. In other words, it really can spread. And if you can do it for glucose levels, if you can do it for A1C levels, if you could do it then to determine, you're not feeling well, do you have the flu, do you have COVID, do you have RSV? Because those tests can be done, point of care, okay? Which means you can now look at also from a drop of blood, it takes about 12 minutes to do the analysis. You can actually go ahead and talk about other aspects of health in a way you couldn't, just by having them come in and look at it. So what's the gist of this? If you're really going to go ahead and try and move toward wellness, and you're going to use data and digitalize, then we have to look at everything deeper than what we're doing right now. We have to look at it more from a deep phenotyping perspective. We have to look at creating processes and ways to do things that allow people to make the change easier. Okay, we have to get it out to where it's more accessible. And I want to point out, no matter what you do, Okay, it never ceases to amaze me how much the healthcare system challenges. So for instance, that all sounds pretty good, but one of the things that one had to do is we actually had to create a app that would take the data that would then be sent out on your smartphones, and actually create basically the equivalent of an electronic written report, which could then be sent by fax electronically, because some of the healthcare providers and some of the pharmacies could only accept the information by fax because they had become more digital. The challenge in the systems are tremendous, and finding a way to move it across. So what I've tried to do is have a bunch of dots that are out there and things that are being done around those dots, but how do you start to bring it all together? And hopefully this has suggested some things to think about. Here are the references, which you'll have online, I understand, for anything I've talked about, and there's my email address. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Give me while I struggle with the microphone here. If anyone has any questions, just give me a wave and I can bring the microphone to you so that Bob's able to hear. Don't be shy. I'll come to you.
Thank you. It was very interesting. Kind of a general question. So I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a professor in the psych department.
Okay.
I'm in Las Vegas. And one thing that I talk to about with my students is this discussion of epigenetics.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, and I'm not clinical, so I'm not a clinical person.
Yeah.
So is it kind of common knowledge among patients that environment can influence your genetics?
Okay, so a couple things that probably are important to say. In terms of your genome, okay, the changes that can occur to the genome are things that there's subtle modifications can be done. They're natural processes within the body, okay, and when those changes are done, methylation of particular bases and so on, it affects the ability of the DNA to unwrap. It's kind of like a tightly wrapped thing that has to unwrap to be able to produce a protein and so on. It can affect all that. So in other words, you could have the gene for a protein, but it actually doesn't express because of epigenetics. And one aspect of that was one always thought that epigenetics was simply something that affected you at the time, wasn't passed on. Then we learned that it was passed on at least one generation. Now we know it's passed on at least 2 generations, and possibly 3. Okay, that's pretty significant that you can actually manipulate that. So with that kind of understanding, does the average individual know that? I'm not so sure. And the other thing is, I'm going to say, and I'm even going to use myself, but shame on me. I'm not even sure if you're knowledgeable about it and you know about it, that you always do the right things that reflect that. Okay? And by that, I mean, there are certainly things I could have done in my life knowing better than I did, but I chose not to. I chose to ignore them, or I just like doing those other things, whatever that was, right? And with that said, that's part of what that better interaction with the healthcare provider, the knowledgeable individual, and that deep phenotyping will do. There are now epigenetic analyses that can be done, but they're not common. In other words, they haven't even hit the stage of pharmacogenomics has, and pharmacogenomics hasn't spread around everything. BC, for instance, the Ministry of Health has looked for 5 years to implement some kind of pharmacogenomics program in the province that hasn't done it yet. Okay, so we're really quite a ways away from that. But what you can know easier, I'd be willing to bet that my doctor, other than in the first form I filled out that said, are you a smoker? And I wrote no. Or do you smoke? And I wrote no or whatever, or put an X and no. I doubt if he's ever asked me. Yeah, what you would want is if that was a smoker, you'd want to know, did you quit smoking? Okay, how long ago did you quit smoking? Were there changes in your health you noticed after you quit smoking? Okay. And so I think you're right. And mental health issues, okay, are going to be significant because they're multi-genetic, right? They're multi-gene, very complex. And it isn't just purely the genomics. It's the nature of the production of RNA, the production of the protein itself, and the level of protein that's produced, even if it is produced. So you're right on.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, for your intriguing presentation. I'm listening to your presentation and with the role of the pharmacist, that you're trying to put in.
Yeah,
And I'm trying to think practically, when people interact with the pharmacist, it's when half the time there's a problem or they've been referred to a pharmacist.
yeah,
And in your presentation, I'm not seeing that interdisciplinary, and I see a additional, a role for pharmacists. I don't see that where the laboratory fits in there, and the people that we are saying patients will be more comfortable talking to pharmacists, but it may be in some cultures, but in some cultures, actually the pharmacist will be seen as the people in the higher power. And I don't see that interdisciplinary what you have.
Okay. That's a fair comment, and I can see it everywhere. I'll use a phrase that the Minister of Health in DC, one of the former ministers of health, would tell me. Said, Bob, it's good what you talk about that pharmacy can do, but I don't see it when I go into my pharmacy. Okay, and I've actually been into the pharmacy that he attended, and he did see those sorts of things. It's a matter of the pharmacy being engaged. If I were to go right now and pick up a prescription, okay, most likely I dropped it off with a technician. Pharmacist played some role in checking that, and it was handed back to me by a technician who tells me when I should take it, how I should take it, what I should eat or not eat or drink or whatever with it, and all these sorts of things. I might not even see the pharmacist. What I'm suggesting to you that if you set up the system right, and the kinds of things that I was trying to talk about there, suddenly what you did, as I said, in the studies that we get done around the pilot, the pharmacists say that the best part of their day was when they worked with the patient doing that point of care testing and did that interaction. So in other words, what it did is it energized them, empowered them to be more interactive with the patient, what we want to get them to do. Okay, and the patient said that before they hadn't really looked at going to that pharmacy versus any other one, it was what was most convenient to them at the time. But now they want to go back to that one because they think they care about me, they understand me better. It is more of a holistic thing that has to happen. That's why I'm saying it's much more of a turnkey, a holistic piece that has to be put out there. Every one of these pieces are being done somewhere. Okay, but if they're not all put together, and that's my issue. Remember, I talked about putting all the points together. That becomes the key. And unless we do that, that's it, I think. And I will say that I've been out as dean here and visited over 500 pharmacies in the province of British Columbia. The Ministry of Health actually gave me a map they use in the ministry. I used to put pins in it because they got a kick out of that when they come visit. Okay, pins of all these places I visited, pharmacies. I saw all sorts of different practice. Okay, there was one pharmacy I went to, I couldn't find it, and I asked the woman at the checkout counter where the pharmacy was, and she said, "See where the hammers are? Go down to the hammers and turn right." Okay, that's not necessarily the healthcare spot you want to be in. Okay, but if you can put all the pieces together. And we're seeing that you can, and that group, that chain realizes that actually, by the way, their leadership had just gone through a meeting about a week and a half ago, and they said that their #1 priority for that group is to implement this concept across the whole thing. That's what has to happen. You got to show that it can work. You can show that it doesn't disrupt everything else. You can show that they can exist fiscally and do it. Okay, and then you got to show that both the patient, the consumer, and the healthcare provider benefit from it.
I have a question about the education that pharmacists are receiving when it comes to your education. I teach motivational interviewing, and I don't know much about pharmacy.
Yeah.
But the more I teach MI, the more I see in my personal experience with the world how many different people in many different jobs would benefit from like backgrounds in motivational interviewing, like class or training. So how do you feel that the training is right now, regardless of like how it could be improved,
Yeah.
whether by economic or another strategy?
Yeah. Well, I will say that certainly over the last 20 years, it's gotten better. And over the last 10 years and last 5 years, each time there seems to be these incremental increases. Most schools of pharmacy, I know Canada and the US, okay, throughout the 4 years of their program, they have quite a bit of true patient care. In other words, they really are out there. The question is, how prepared are they when they go out? That's really what you're asking. And what I will say is, in some programs, they do quite a bit. I know in our program here, one of the things we do is we have early first year students before they really have the technical and sophisticated knowledge, okay, to really interact with patients and provide advice. What we do is we have them interact with patients just to help at nursing homes and things. It's something rather special to talk to individuals that are challenged, elderly. And I gotta tell you, having an individual that they come close to actually pass away and actually experience that, okay, is pretty significant on them and it changes them. The other thing that I will say is, having had some of those experiences with individuals in the program, suddenly now I had, for instance, and while it's just one example, I've seen quite a number of these. I had a young lady that I served as a mentor for in the medical program, who decided that she didn't want to take her rotation where she was at a community pharmacy in downtown Vancouver. She wanted to actually go into the downtown east side, because she wanted to do something where she could interact with patients that are much more challenged. Simply because of having interacted in a nursing home where the patients were more challenged. So that's it, but what technical skills and abilities do they have that better get them to do that, have that kind of interaction, and then be able to ask the right questions, interact comfortably? That's a good question. I'm not sure that we have it. I'm not sure we're.
Hello, thank you for that. In where I'm from in Australia, in Queensland, we've seen a massive change to how pharmacists can diagnose. For example, if you go to a pharmacist, if you have a urinary tract infection without seeing a general practitioner, and they can diagnose that and prescribe you antibiotics under this scheme that's currently being pushed through our pharmacy guilds and through our universities trial at the moment. That's been great at improving access to particularly antibiotics.
And the speed at which you're able to.
Yes, without having to wait maybe 24 to 48 hours to see a practitioner or a doctor and then prescribe medication. But at the same time, we've seen cuts to federal funding for pharmaceutical benefit scheme, which greatly impacts the funding that pharmacists receive when dispensing medications. So my question is, as academics and consumers, patients, what kind of things can we do to lobby to help our pharmacists receive these kind of benefits?
Well, you know, that's actually a good question for what it's worth. So a couple things there. First of all, I'm actually excited. I head for Queensland next week. Okay, the International Pharmaceutical Federation will be there, and I'm sure we'll hear quite a bit about the issues you face. With that said, I've yet to meet anybody in the Ministry of Health that isn't really committed to try and do what's right and to make a difference. Okay, but it's so hard to figure out what that is, and they have so many voices telling them what it is. So one of the things that becomes important, okay, is to speak with a broader, knowledgeable voice. Okay, by that, so for instance, okay, in one of the projects that I was involved with, a particular pharmacy chain said that what they wanted to do was sign an exclusive agreement. As sitting on the board, I said we weren't going to do that. And the reason is nobody is going to support your company, but they will support the concept of delivering point of care if it's in multiple ways to deliver it. We are agnostic in terms of the equipment, but we look for what the best equipment is that could be validated, certified, whatever, not with a particular company. So I think one thing is that. And we gotta break out of this idea that it's a company X issue or a company Y issue, it's gotta be broader than that. Second thing is you gotta get all the right players together, so in other words, it's not just simply a pharmaceutical company or a device company or whatever. Okay, and it's not just patient groups, because payers and government, certainly ministries of health, really recognize the fact that a lot of these patient groups are funded by industry. But if you get if you get multiple groups together, okay, then that makes a difference. And the other thing is that you have to be really, really careful. Because pharmacy for a long time, over the last 15 years ago, when I was trying to push for a number of changes, kept pushing those changes that pharmacy was the less expensive alternative to medicine doing it. You are not going to produce in any of our lifetimes enough physicians to meet the need in delivering healthcare if physicians were the only way to deliver that. So you've got nurse practitioners, you got pharmacists, you got all sorts of people that do parts of this. Okay, but you can't do it on the basis that it's cheaper. You have to show why it is better, and you have to document it. But it's part of your conference. You have to get data to prove it. Okay, anecdotally, okay, it is important. And as the Minister of Health said to me quite often, I don't really care that you tell me this is good. I want to know that other people that we have respect for, tell me, does the UK think what you're doing good? Does such and such think what you're doing good? So it's a broader piece. Now, maybe that's what's needed. But there's always going to be a rush down to how to control cost. I don't know where it is exactly in BC, because to be honest, I didn't look at it before the conference. But up until just probably 18 months ago, just barely under 50% of all the revenue taken in by the province went out for healthcare. Not counting the money you got from the federal government to do that. This is an expensive endeavor, and it is an endeavor that can't keep up with that rate, because we have to build schools and roads, bridges, all sorts of things, right? So we've got to figure out a way to do this. And part of it is what's part of your thing, it's wellness, right? How do we stay healthy out of that? An individual that I have tremendous respect for, and he's the one that talked about the P4 medicine. Okay, he said to me that it's interesting. He started a company around this P4 medicine concept. And he said it's the easiest company that he ever started, raised almost $1 billion fairly quickly. Several nations actually funded his work, changed the way they deliver healthcare. Okay, he said, but you know, the number one thing that's needed out there, it's counseling, it's coaching. In other words, when you have all that information, how do you get the individual to utilize it? And how do you help the person with that information? Or knowing how to use that information, how do you get them to help the patient do it? It gets a little bit at, how you coach.
Thank you, Dr. Sindelar, for the presentation full of insight. Mine is not a question, just a comment. As a social scientist, how the presentation resonates with me is the significance of the multidisciplinarity.
I'm sorry, the significance of
The multidisciplinarity when we work with patients. For me, that change from admission to discharge, one of the healthcare professionals, it might not be a pharmacist, it might be a nurse, it might be a doctor, might have a full information about the whole patient or the whole person, which could eventually contribute to the healing process or the improvement of the diagnosis. So I just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Yeah. To your comment, as individuals during the conference, take a moment and think to yourself, what happens when somebody presents themselves in the emergency room and they are having trouble breathing? Have you ever really given thought all that has to happen to diagnose what that actually is? Is it asthma? Is it COPD? Okay, are they having a heart attack? Is there a viral issue involved? There's a whole set of things, and potentially tests and expensive things that happen. But imagine how much information you could get about the individual if the right questions were being asked, right? People were interacting with that individual in a caring, empathetic way, collecting that information. You were actually talking to that individual's wife husband, daughter, son,